Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Right to Read initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Nathaniel Swain from La Trobe University, where he is a senior lecturer, and he's also the founder of Think Forward Educators. Now, I'm really excited for this episode because we're going to be talking about the science of learning. And you have recently published a new book called Harnessing the Science of Learning. And I think it's wonderful. You
Oh, that's
definitely
very
have
kind.
it as a good way to bridge the research to practice. And instead of some of those, not higher order thinking, but more cognitive books like Dr. Stanislas Dehaene's How We Learn, or what's that other one?
Like Kirshner, Sweller, and Clark's, or Kirshner and Hendricks, How Learning Happens, you might be
That's
thinking of. Yeah,
exactly what I was
yeah.
thinking of. I'm like, oh, what is it? Yes, How Learning Happens or How Teaching Happens.
Mm.
Those are great if you're wanting a more intellectual read. And not that yours
And
isn't.
comprehensive.
Like
Yeah, really
it's a very
comprehensive. Yeah.
comprehensive, research-based. Yours is great, and that's for the everyday teacher that doesn't have to have read a million different papers, because you give them the foundation of what they need to know, and you say, hey, look, these are some great resources that you can go look for more information, and see, you know what, I've actually seen this work in a classroom, and this is what happened,
Mm.
or this is what happened in the school, and this is how it was done. So it's one of those practical implementation guides, which I think is definitely missing.
Oh, thank you. That's a really kind summary. And it is a pleasure to speak to you again, Dr. Garforth. Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So what I want to do to start off our conversation is make sure that we cover the definitions of the common terms that we're going to be talking about in this episode. Now, the first one is, what is the science of learning, both from a macro perspective and a micro perspective, right?
Yeah.
So there's the big umbrella term that everybody refers to, but then what's the nitty gritty of it?
Mm. So, I'll try and tackle this as succinctly as I can. Science of learning broadly is a body of knowledge that we've gained from scientific research, and is the key principles, I guess, that have been verified and have been tested, and at this point in time, because it is a dynamic process, are well supported by scientific research about how learning happens and how best to teach. To drill down into it, I think some of the nitty gritty, as you've said, point to the importance of things like teachers teaching really explicitly and really sequentially and systematically in the first for the first port of call, but also encouraging students to use research-based learning strategies such as retrieval practice and self-elaboration and generative learning and spaced and retrieval practice and interleaving, for example. So not just explicit teaching, but in many debates at the moment, explicit teaching is the point of contention, hence why it comes up quite a bit. But really about the idea of practice, about that gradual release of responsibility, and not in a tokenistic sense, but actually when is the right time to release responsibility to learners. And also a really key one that I always come back to is checking for understanding. So how teachers can ensure that their teaching is having the impact that they want in real time, not at the end of the unit and not the end of the lesson.
Definitely. And I remember, in earlier iterations, we would have heard of, formative and summative
Mm,
assessments, and just understanding how that can inform our practice, because we all want the same outcome, right? Our students learning as much as possible in the most meaningful way
mm,
that gets
definitely.
all of them to the finish line at roughly the same time.
Mm,
And one
definitely.
the big things that I like about the science of learning is being able to catch things sooner, right? And recognizing that the more you do something incorrectly, the more you're going to have to spend a lot longer fixing it,
It's
you know,
unlearning and everything.
and
Yeah, exactly.
unlearning and relearning and the confusion and falling into old habits. So recognizing what we can do to make our jobs easier as educators.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think that idea of checking for understanding being a more specific, actionable sort of variation or subset of formative assessment, I think is really helpful because we need to be assessing not just at the end of the unit or the product at the end and giving that summation, but also throughout the learning. It should be part of the learning process to give feedback to our students and to use that information in real time. So yeah, checking for understanding using things like pair shares and cold calls and whiteboards, for example, as some of those quick ones, or multiple choice questions might be another one. They can be really powerful because they tell you as a teacher, are you on the right track, or are you are you going to run into some trouble here if you let this sort of continue, as you said, with the having to relearn or fix misconceptions later down the track.
Well, and it also allows you to recognize the students that have it, have a good understanding of it, and you can release that scaffolding or that structure a little bit more quickly for them.
Mm,
So you don't get this whole drill and kill, which doesn't
mm,
exist,
mm.
mentality and opposition. Well, what about your students that are gifted or exceptional or understand what you're doing? Well, they've got the explicit learning that has happened during the lesson, and it's going to deepen their understanding of the concept, fill in the holes that they just made cognitive leaps that they don't understand the full process of
So
getting there.
true. Yeah.
But we're giving them that foundation and saying, okay, now you can go off and put it into practice while we do more review for the individuals that need it.
Yes, and that's exactly what I think I say in a few times in the book, and what other great writers in this space talk about is that it's the differentiation by the amount of support you provide, but not necessarily a different content or different curriculum for different kids. And I think that avoids putting limits on students as well, and assuming that the students who might be underperforming currently are going to stay like that because we're going to give them an easier, less challenging form of the curriculum. I think this is a really important point in this day and age where differentiation is seen as giving them different content or giving them a completely different way of working, when in fact you just might need to give really good high quality instruction and then follow that up with different levels of support and opportunities to show your learning in different, in multiple levels of attainment that might happen, or different levels that you tap out and say, I've got this now, I'm ready to do independent work. Others might need a bit longer, as you said, to review and to consolidate.
Mm-hmm. And there's some terms that we're hearing a lot more of that are really important for educators to understand, and that traditionally wasn't being discussed in the teacher education programs, and in many
Mm,
programs they're still not discussed.
mm,
And one of them is something that I find so huge, and that is talking about cognitive load theory and understanding its relationship with working memory. So can you
mm.
start out and just give us the nitty gritty on cognitive load theory and why it's important for our
Def Yeah,
instruction?
definitely. To start with a practical example, I think we all have seen what happens with our learners when they get overwhelmed with something that they might be trying to learn. They start sort of um, getting distracted. They might start sort of showing physical signs of, finding it really difficult, or their performance might just start slipping, for example. Essentially, our working memories and all of our students' working memories are extremely limited. So if we overload the number of items in their working memory, learning cannot essentially happen because all learning has to pass through attention, working memory, and into our long-term memory. And the thing that helps it get a lot easier is if students have more things in their long-term memory to draw upon in order to see patterns or see ideas or to see connections, that therefore make the chunks that they're thinking about a lot easier. So the classic example of this is looking at chess players, for example, who in this series of experiments were asked to reproduce a board of chess pieces. And what they showed was that the really expert master chess players could reproduce a board from the middle of a game almost to, within one piece of accuracy. So nearly all the pieces exactly in the right position. What was interesting though with the experiment is that they did the same thing again with the same players, both all still really expert, and gave them a randomly configured board of 26 pieces or however many were on the board at the time. And they had very poor performance, the same level of performance as a novice chess player or someone who doesn't know the rules of chess. And what they hypothesized and what sort of has led to theories of cognitive load theory and expert sort of theories as well, what is expertise, is that when learners have things that are meaningful in their long-term memory and they can apply them to a task that is impossible or very difficult, such as reproducing, the placement of many different things all in one place, becomes a lot easier because they actually see patterns and they see connections and they see, algorithms for different moves that might be happening. And this is what happens when you read a book and you're a literate person. You don't get overwhelmed by the squiggles on the page or the stage directions in a Shakespearean sort of play, or the archaic language. You might say, oh, I remember all of this, or you might notice the nitty gritty things that are there. But for a novice reader, you do get overwhelmed by all that stuff, and you therefore can't complete anything near the performance of an expert on that task. So to summarize then, cognitive load theory is and I'm going to use Ollie Lovell's very clever and clear definition that is used in his book, Cognitive Load Theory in Action, which is a great handbook for teachers. Cognitive load theory is a series of instructional recommendations on how humans learn that takes into account the cognitive architecture. So the fact that working memory is limited and that long-term memory is the tool that we can use to overcome those limitations by giving our students more things to recognize, more patterns, more tools, more things that are automatized in their memory that makes the task that they might be doing a lot easier. So this is why explicit instruction is so helpful, because it gets things into students' long-term memory in an efficient way so that they can attack more and more complex tasks as they move forward.
Yeah, of course. And, one thing that I don't think is talked about enough when it comes to cognitive load theory and working memory is the external demands on it,
Hmm. Hmm.
and recognizing that, cognitive load isn't fixed and there's so many factors that come into play. Talking about, kids having enough sleep,
Hmm.
other
Hmm.
stressors that are happening in their lives, whether the topic is of interest to them,
Mm.
what's going on in the classroom and on the walls.
Mm.
And
Definitely.
unfortunately, social media has made it so we want to have it so it's ready for Instagram or whatever social media
Oh, definitely.
platform that you
Mm.
have,
It's the
because
challenge.
it's beautiful and gorgeous, when really it can be very distracting for our students and they're more interested in something else.
Mm.
And then recognizing that when we are working with individuals that have neurodiversity or neurominorities, their development of the skills is lagged or behind their peers. So while it would be perfect for someone who is neurotypical
Hmm.
or neuromajority, then the ones that aren't are going to be struggling because they don't have the same resources available. And
Mm. That regulation sort of ability to focus and to ignore the external stimuli and things like that.
one example that I like thinking of is learning how to line dance. And when someone knows a line dance, they can do it with their eyes closed and it doesn't matter what anyone else is doing around them. But when you're first learning the steps, or whether it's whatever, you know, dance routine, a flash mob, or whatever, when you're first trying to learn it, unless you're an expert dancer and know it really, really well, or it's similar to one you already know,
Hmm.
it takes a while and you're tripping over yourself.
Mm. And you need
And
it to be a calm, focused environment to be able to
exactly.
actually learn and to actually learn from those experiences. Because otherwise, you're distracted by the background noise or distracted by other people who are doing a different dance but are in the same
And they even might have
space.
it wrong.
Or they might be getting it wrong. So it's misconceptions. Exactly. All of those distractors suddenly become the focus. And because our working memories are really easily distracted and moved, and our attention sort of will allocate to whatever the next shiny thing is. So yeah, I think the distinction there as well between intrinsic load, the kind like how difficult the task is, and we want it to be not too hard, not too easy, because otherwise students will get bored because it's too easy as well.
Mhm.
So it's intrinsic load versus extraneous load. So the kinds of distractions that you're talking about there, Kath, Kathryn. It's like, they could be huge. It could be what the teacher's wearing. It could be how the classroom's laid out. It could be the background noise, the visual sort of noise. And the beautiful classroom movement has not helped in this regard, because there's more and more put onto classroom walls and decorations now, more than ever, as well as GIFs and crazy fonts and things, and themes that follow throughout the slides that teachers might use, or worksheets. So extraneous load is a real hazard in terms of learning happening, because cognitive load can be taken up not just by the task itself, the intrinsic load, but by all the extra stuff.
Of course. And also recognizing whether the students are in an active role in their learning or
Mm.
a passive role in their learning. And the beauty of using more of an explicit approach to instruction is, especially when we're checking for our students' understanding, we're forcing them into that active role of learning instead of that passive role where it's easy for them to get distracted and,
Sit back. Yeah.
yeah, lose
Well,
control.
I love the Anita Archer quote that learning isn't a spectator sport. And I
Mhm.
think that really says a lot about, when I run professional learning for teachers as well, they're probably used to sitting back for most of the day and maybe doing a few open-ended tasks or discussions with the people on their table. But I sort of crush any of those misillusions pretty quickly and say, this is going to be an active learning opportunity. You're going to be doing a lot of talking. You're going to be working with your partner. You're going to be doing whiteboard responses, because I have mini whiteboards that I use with all of my adult professional learning experiences. And we're going to do cold calls as well. So everyone's name goes on a stick, and we're going to be willing to hear responses from anyone in the room at any time. And that takes some setting up and some building of people's confidence and things. But the benefit is that suddenly I've got a room full of very actively engaged people, and they're also really, I think, knowing that they can push themselves a little bit more than they usually would. And I think for our students, it's the same. We want them to feel like there's a reason to have to try and to throw your hat in the ring and to give things a go, and feel comfortable to try and also make errors and make mistakes. That culture of error is so important, and you can't get it if learning is and participation is optional.
Mhm. Well, and it's so important in these situations that we're setting our learners up for success,
Hmm.
regardless of where they're at in their learning.
Mm.
So that if we're doing a cold call and we recognize that the student isn't quite there, we modify the question before we ask it in our heads. Whereas if we know that the students, you know, really got this concept well, we can tailor the question to their needs or
Yeah,
their
I think that
ability.
some things they say faking the stick is an option there, and I think it's not because you're trying to be deceptive. It's because you're trying to be really responsive and really adaptive in your teaching, so that you do orchestrate success. Because success will contribute to students' motivation, and then they'll feel more comfortable to be to take more risks with their learning, or to feel more comfortable to try and to participate. So yeah, it's definitely a really important dance that teachers are doing there in terms of how they're getting responses and things to happen. It's not easy to get it started in your classroom straight away necessarily, and there's a lot of trial and error potentially, but great coaching and great professional learning and doing that reading that I think a lot of teachers are doing, those deep dives into this knowledge at the moment, can help you to have the best possible chance of giving it a go as well.
Of course. And recognizing that, this transition into the science of learning isn't a flip of the switch overnight thing that happens effortlessly. So, in the beginning, especially when you're working with your curriculum, it's gonna take longer. It's gonna take, a couple hours in the evening, really going through it step by step, understanding. I would even write out a list of questions that I'm going to use for my write boards and my code calls and my pair shares and all that sort of thing so that
Mm.
I have it. And in the moment, it's not slipping out of my mind, right? Because Johnny's doing something that he shouldn't be, and I need to focus on the behavior side of the classroom management as opposed to the instructional side.
Definitely. It's like that mental preparation and that running through beforehand is so important. So you are confident with delivery. You want to have nutted out exactly, the kinds of things that you'll be doing, because you need to be responsive. You can't just reproduce it from the notes that you've got verbatim. Like, you actually need to, as you said, respond to the kids in real time, which makes it a really cognitively taxing exercise education for teachers as well. It's teachers' cognitive load as well as for students.
Definitely. And when we're talking about this instruction, it's not like we're teaching things that are pre-wired into the brain to these students, right?
Mm,
One of the things that I've been reading about a lot lately is the history of written language,
mm,
the writing systems, and seeing how it went from purely an accounting and a census type of thing to really the sharing of knowledge, and how much society has grown over time because we are now taking for granted learning that took centuries to build upon. And we
mm,
can get it so quickly. So even though it's something that's not biologically primary, that where brains are already set up to learn, it is something that we can do quite easily with the appropriate supports along the way.
mm.
So
It's,
how do
it's sort of the importance of the instruction, isn't it?
yeah, how do you like to distinguish between a biologically primary and a biologically secondary thing for educators to really understand the concept?
Definitely. So, if you're unfamiliar with that distinction that you've made there, and you might be listening to this and thinking, "What's that biologically primary thing?" So, David Geary is one of the evolutionary psychologists that talks about things that we have evolved in order to be able to do things like spoken language, things like being dropped into an environment and being able to just find your way around and create like a little mental map of where you are, so you don't get lost. And also things like basic problem solving skills, the things that when children see an object fall off a table, and they might be very, very young, so 6 to 12 months, that they gaze to see where it's gone. So, basic problem solving skills and the ability to trial and error and things like that are all very much can be learned through acculturation and through socialization, and they're biologically primary skills and things that we've evolved to be very good at. Learning from others is also another biologically primary skill. We're good at following and observing and monitoring and taking information in and sort of making inferences about it. Something that is new, which you're getting at there with writing, but also things like mathematics, these are biologically secondary because they've come much later in our evolutionary history, in just the last 5,000 years, if not more recently. And, mass literacy is not a very old concept.
Mm.
So even if it's been around for 5,000 years, the idea of everyone learning how to read or to write is, in the last 150 years, if not more recently, depending on the country. So I think it's important to remind ourselves that some things are difficult for students to learn, and this is where cognitive load theory applies, is for that biologically secondary knowledge. So it's easy for students to get overwhelmed when they're learning things from mathematics or from human sort of fields that are more complicated or more academic. So history and geography and sciences and the arts, for example. It's really important that if we know that it's biologically secondary, that we don't shy away from teaching it explicitly. You can't discover your way to do this unless you have a few thousand years up your hand to sort of up your sleeve, sorry, to be able to figure some of these things out of what the relationship is between the scribbly sort of symbols and the speech that they represent. So that distinction I find very helpful and very reassuring to teachers who worry that, oh, shouldn't students have a chance to learn this for themselves, and are we taking that opportunity away from them? And it's, well, yes, you might be taking away from them for the moment, but they would be going through many more inefficient processes to find their way there, and may well embed very problematic misconceptions that are hard to remove, such as, if you just look at the decoding sort of side of things, students that have memorized words based on how they look may be really finding it hard to remove those substitutions and those errors with their decoding skills for many, many sort of years afterwards, even after you've taught them how to decode each word carefully and to ensure they understand the sound letter correspondence. So we're doing them a favor by setting them up for success, as we've been talking about on the episode so far.
Yeah, and I think a really good distinction to make at this point is the difference between a novice learner and an expert learner. And when does someone transition between the novice, I guess, then to the
Mm,
intermediate before the expert?
mm,
Because we need to recognize that in classrooms, the majority of the individuals that we are working with are the novice learners. So we need to set the instruction and the pedagogy up for the novice learner because those are the rule, not the exception.
yeah, and I think if we're finding that, depending on what we're teaching, we've got mainly expert learners in the room, we've probably, given at school, and we're not working in an environment where the focus is on productivity or the focus is on output, such as in a company or as in an organization, we are focusing on learning. So if we've chosen something where everyone's an expert on it, we've probably chosen the wrong thing. So I think the work of educators will be moving students along that continuum that you're getting at there, from novice to expert. And one of the things that separates novices and experts is their ability to see those wide patterns and see those exemplars, and to know how to understand the deep structure of a problem or a task, and sort of see how they're connected to others that they've done before, and therefore be able to solve them more quickly. But when students are not at that level of expertise and don't have all that stuff in their long-term memory, then they benefit from much more clear, scaffolded, and guided learning experiences that allow them to experience more success and get much more rapid feedback. I'm not saying that teachers shouldn't be getting ready for students to become independent and expert. In fact, we want them to, once they're at a certain level of expertise, to be able to apply and extend and challenge their own thinking and do those sort of extended projects or applications down that end. But once they've done that, and you've seen where that has ended up, it's probably time for some more explicit teaching of some new content or some other things that challenge their thinking even further, because otherwise we're just facilitating students' self-guided sort of approach, which you could do, but is essentially inefficient, and in many ways it becomes ineffective for those students that really need us and maybe at that novice stage of their learning for a lot of things, and would benefit from much more targeted and systematic instruction.
Of course. And recognizing that we want the most efficient process, but we also want to recognize and understand that each student's coming from a different place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's where, if we're looking at other information that we can collect about the student through screening processes, the better
Mm-hmm.
that we can target our teaching and make the learning more appropriate for the student. Now, one of the things that I hear locally, and I'm coming from British Columbia, Canada, where we're talking about a lot of truth and reconciliation with the First Nations students who had a lot of damage done in residential schools to them. And there is a lot of trauma. And there are
Mm.
other cultures. We have individuals who are coming as refugees from various places, and understanding that that trauma comes to them with the classroom, and how can that inhibit learning, and what does that look like when we're trying to use the science of learning in our instructional strategies?
So it's a great question, and I really like the work of Zaretta Hammond in this space, who's done a great job of connecting professionals to the links between trauma-informed practice, culturally responsive practice, and scientific, principles of learning. So I think one of the things to remember is that when students are experiencing a trauma response, or are experiencing having experiences that might be triggering, for example, that the learning is it's not going to really take place. So we need to help our students to feel safe and to feel valued and to feel welcomed into the environment, and that we often, I think it's important to remember that teachers shouldn't try and take the place of counselors or social workers or psychologists, and that we have to stay in our lane and really be guided by the expertise in those other professions, but that we can do things that are helpful to all students and helpful to those especially from backgrounds of trauma and who've had those adverse experiences, and basically be a very relational centered person, and a teacher that does take into account the sociocultural and the psychological safety of our students as well. So being trustworthy, being sort of transparent in how you like to operate, being clear and predictable, things that are really good for trauma often are actually really good for just learners in general. So having a clear, predictable structure in the way that you usually work, building up students' success so that they don't feel like they're caught off guard or that you've tried to put them on the spot, really trying to ensure that they know that something is coming or that something might change today, or here's a variation interaction that might be happening, and having a clear overview for what the day or the lesson might look like. And at the curriculum level, like I think something reassuring for learners are things like advanced organizers, where they can see what the shape of multiple lessons might be, and that
Mhm.
over time they can see how different ideas in the unit of work that they're doing can actually evolve and take place, and not thinking, oh, this lesson's coming out of nowhere, I've got no idea what this is. So in many ways, trauma-informed practice can be linked to something called meaningful learning theory, where we
Mhm.
try and ensure that what we're teaching can connect to students' prior knowledge and prior understandings, and therefore create meaningful touch points with what they're now learning and what the target is. And I think there's something really important to point out is that as Ojibel is a theorist of meaning learning theory, says that one of the best predictors of future learning is past learning. So we have to take that into account in all the planning that we're doing, so that on a daily basis we can create a place of safe and welcoming and nurturing experiences, but also ones that seek to extend and to challenge and to give students cognitive benefits. That there's a reason to try this because it's something new, or it's connecting to something you've learnt before, but it's more challenging. I think where I've seen extreme versions of choice provided in the name of trauma informed theory, it's essentially led to teachers being too safe in what they do, and not wanting to put students through the really important process of extending their thinking and sort of going beyond what they're comfortable with. So I think as long as you're taking a grain of salt with some of the recommendations there around, we want students to feel validated and to see themselves in the curriculum, but we also want to extend their thinking and to open up the possibilities that are there from learning about things outside of their experience. I think that can be enriching. It can be a helpful distraction for students who may be experiencing ongoing sort of adverse circumstances, and it can also be enriching in what they do next with their learning, and not learning about things that are further to the experiences they've had so far.
Yeah, that's very true. Now, one thing that, just thinking about some of the culturally
Mm,
informed and trauma informed, that some people may get a misunderstanding of when
mm,
we're talking about explicit teaching or the science of
mm,
teaching, is we're not saying that kids need to be in rows like you see in movies from the 19, I don't know, 50s or whatever, reciting after the teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. That could be traumatic for, and I guess when we're talking about the trauma, it's the trauma that the parents have experienced and the
mm. So
grandparents have
vicariously
experienced.
through parents, yeah, exactly.
And
Mm,
then the children take this as a negative, even though it's not their personal experience, right? So it's that
mm, mm.
generational trauma.
Yeah, so I think how we organize the classroom environment and how we structure our day, and ensuring that students' voice and students' ability to participate are really front and center, is really key. I think some educators that have been thinking about things like extraneous load have rethought how they sort of organize their tables and things like that. And I really like it when students can easily see the teacher and easily see the learning in front of them. And I think there's a variety of classroom structures that help support that. Sometimes when we have the default position where all of the tables are sorted into clusters and groups, it can make it harder when you're doing some active guided practice for students to actually be able to see the board. They have to crane their neck or turn their body to be able to see what's happening at the front of the room, which doesn't lend itself as well to getting that active feedback and things you can do with mini whiteboards, for example. But I think certainly we don't want to pretend or to sort of deceive ourselves into thinking that applying aspects of explicit instruction means going back to a 1950s or 1960s view of teaching and learning. I think instead we're trying to see what really does help, and what helps to manage the extraneous and optimize the intrinsic load of the teaching that we're trying to do. And part of that could be as simple as the teacher providing clear instructions and clearer connections, and keeping things that can be familiar and can be predictable, just that, and then giving appropriate levels of challenge or novelty for the things that are new that they're trying to teach. So I think there's lots of competing demands on teachers to make good choices in their classroom. But what's exciting is that there's lots of examples within, that I've tried to capture in this book, for example, of how schools have started to interpret this research and put it into practice, but also other schools around the world, in Canada and the US and other places, of how they can ensure that the time that they spend with their students is the most effective use of everyone's time, because at the end of the day, students can't get that time back. So I think many things have been done in the name of making things more accessible or making things more student-centered. And I think we just have to balance what seems like a good idea with what's supported by the research as well. So really trying to be critically thinking in what we decide to do.
Definitely. Now, another thing that, again, is very prominent in Canada and specifically BC is teacher autonomy.
As it is in Australia as well. Yeah.
And the suggestion of doing something along the science of learning or any of the other sciences related to curriculum means that we're taking autonomy away from teachers. Now, I know in my personal opinion, anything that's going to impact the student's ability to learn should not have to do with autonomy. We need to have the best and most effective practices for all teachers to use. And, the method and the exact delivery is up to personal interpretation, but it's not how you deliver it.
Mm,
I
mm,
think we were talking about this, the art of teaching
mm,
in your book,
mm,
and how it's artful teaching, I think is how you
mm. Well, and
call
it's not just all, the precision, the science,
it.
the sort of the effectiveness, but I think if it's all art and no science, we're in trouble, because you see teaching not as a collection of go-to practices or really helpful techniques, but as something that is completely derived from a teacher's personal philosophy. So I think that is where we are in a lot of the time in initial teacher education, or in the way that teachers are supported in their early career, is to say, well, you create the program, you create your own way of doing things. It's completely up to you. And some teachers will thrive with that level of autonomy, and others will probably say, this is really hard and I don't know how to manage this class, or this is some difficult behaviors or learning challenges that I haven't been able to respond to. So I think at any profession does need to balance autonomy and agency with accountability. And so we are accountable, I think, and legislatively in many jurisdictions, to ensuring that we provide the best possible education. And that means not just um, rolling the dice and hoping that something that we choose, or that we look up online, or sort of happen to adopt, is going to produce the same outcomes as approaches or practices that are well supported. So I think any profession that's not just a craft, or not just a collection of willing people who've taken the call and sort of said, I want to be an educator. If we're teachers and we're registered and we are professionals, we do have to balance individual sort of styles and things like that and preferences with things that actually work really well. I think around the world, we are getting more of a sense of government, depending on the jurisdiction, of course. In Australia and parts of in the UK and parts of the US, there's more sort of starting to be some alignment between things that are required of teachers and what the science indicates is a good use of teachers' time. But sometimes jurisdictions actually contribute to unwinding some of those things that might be effective, or contributing to a blurring of the lines between effective and ineffective practices, which is not easy for teachers to choose. Nowadays, though, I see it as my mission to try and connect educators with things that are going to be helpful to their practice, not because I want them to be like a little teaching robot that reproduces things that someone else has done before, but because some of these practices and ways of teaching, techniques and so on, are so useful that no matter how you like to teach, these are going to be helpful and are going to be impactful in your work. And at the end of the day, I'm all about teacher well-being being improved by teachers feeling more satisfied and more efficacious, and that they can actually make more of an impact. And I think there are millions of ways in which you can enact and to bring to life the science of learning in your classroom. But many, you've got to talk about the things that are common amongst us as educators and as instructors. There are just really good ways of going about getting information across to our students and ensuring they can practice and achieve that mastery and expertise. And there's ways that are probably quite inefficient or inequitable, in that only some students will benefit from it because of their background knowledge or background skill.
Of course. And really, I feel when we're talking about, implementing the science of learning into our classrooms, we're not talking about taking away teacher autonomy. We're talking about reducing their cognitive load,
Mm,
allowing them to focus on the personalization
mm. And
and
responsiveness. Yeah.
the responsiveness and the expertise that they can add from their own background knowledge, instead of saying, okay, well, in your training program, you didn't learn about this or how to do it in an efficacious manner for your students. So we're going to expect you to do that while handling tasks, classroom management strategies, and the behavior issues within the classroom, as well as the diverse learning needs and this and this and this. We're saying, okay, well, let's remove that so you can focus on the elements that we can't easily take away from you. And one
And we
thing,
don't want, it's not like it's not coming from a place of, I guess, control. I think many people would see some of these initiatives as governments or research of the scientific sort of consensus trying to control the work of teachers. I think it's less about that and more about trying to ensure that teachers have the best available tools in their toolkit. So I haven't met a teacher who has learnt about these practices and who has seen some of them in action and started to use them in their classroom. I haven't seen some of them saying, you know what, that whole checking for understanding thing, I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to leave all of that checking for the end of unit assessment because I don't really want to do those questions. And I think that once you know about this stuff, I think many teachers who are interested in becoming more effective and more efficient, which should be the majority of teachers, because it makes your life easier above everything else, even if you're not as focused on the student outcomes, which really should be where we're thinking. But you might be thinking of, I just want to treat this as a job, which is fine. And many teachers would be thinking, I just want a job that is enriching and that is relatively easy and it's not going to take over my life because I've got other things I have to think about. So even if you just take the perspective of it's going to make your life easier, when teachers have seen how these work, they're like, oh wow, that would make my life easier. I will start using that, which is where I think the stories, the examples, the illustrations can be helpful because it shows teachers there's many ways to make this work in your classroom, but there's far too many practices or common sense understandings that are really prolific at the moment that don't align with these practices. And unless you have that knowledge about what the research is really pointing to as effective or not, you won't be able to make an informed decision to know what's a useful practice or tool that you could use or not.
of course, and we've been focusing mainly on learning in our conversation, but I think it's important to note that this has positive impacts on behavior and your
Oh,
classroom
certainly.
management. And it's not that we're just trying to get all A+ students, which would be lovely. I'm not saying we
Mm,
can't, but it's going to help the students that have problems with behavior and have, disruptive classroom tendencies with
mm,
that understanding of how things are going. So they're not always on edge, indolent in the fight or flight stance because they know
mm,
what's going to
mm.
happen.
And it links to the idea of being more trauma informed and being more responsive in that I think if you're more intentional and for older students, if you actually give them some of these insights about how learning happens and how motivation is connected to learning and that it's a cognitive and social process, that students can actually make better choices as well with the way that they interact with learning materials and with the teacher in real time and also in their own study habits as well. And I think it's empowering. It helps students to understand that there's a reason why we're creating high expectations for routines and high expectations for norms in the classroom. Because when these norms are, not followed, or when students impact on other people's learning because of decisions or choices that they're making, then it does affect people's ability to focus and to make the best use of their time. And ultimately means that students feel less good about their learning and about school because it becomes a not so nice experience if teachers are having to be reactive and be disciplinarian and really trying to focus in on behavioral problems all the time in that reactive sort of way. Ideally, we're proactive and we set students up for success. We help them to feel comfortable, and we have tiered responses for behavior as well as for academics. So we have the tier one response where everyone is given access to a behavior curriculum and they're taught and they're given opportunities to practice and rehearse what the good learning and social behaviors look like in the various school contexts. And then we have tier two and tier three responses for students that need that additional support, reinforcement, that additional just person to check in with and to check in and out in terms of how they're going, and giving them the motivation that they need to do the right thing so that they do set themselves up for success and not get into that cycle of spending less time in class than in. I think some stories that I've shared in the book from primary schools like Chalice Primary and Churchill Primary is that those students who have the biggest behavioral issues often have a lot of self-efficacy issues and don't feel confident with their learning. And it becomes a vicious cycle between not feeling motivated, acting out a little bit, not learning as much, falling further behind, therefore not feeling motivated or successful, and on it goes until students drop out and end up in where I used to work, which is juvenile detention and youth justice. And, students there feeling like school was never a safe place and was never a welcoming place, and teachers didn't support them the way that they could have. And I think in many cases, a lot of those kids that I've worked with in the past would have had better experiences if the teachers knew about the connections between learning, behavior, regulation, motivation, knowing that it's not about just trying to hook them into the learning and get them excited about it and hope for the best. It's actually about breaking the learning down into manageable chunks so that they don't feel overwhelmed and don't feel overloaded, and they can experience those little wins that help them to feel more successful at reading or mathematics or spelling or whatever it might be.
All in all, I think a lot of the concepts that we've been speaking about today are ones that if we had just got them at the beginning of our training, life would
So
have
much easier.
so much easier. We wouldn't have the same, if only, oh, I wish I'd that with this student or that student. But recognizing that this is a learning process and things that we're telling you today are very likely to stay true, but we may find out in a year or a couple more years, especially with the way technology is going and how much we have learned through the imaging studies that we are able to do to actively see the human brain while it is learning, gives us better understanding of how we can do better.
And that's, I think, reassuring as well that, harnessing the science of learning, as the book is called, is not a static process. This is something that's ongoing, it's dynamic. It's really a commitment to being a much more evidence-informed profession, so that as new research comes out that has big implications on how learning and teaching are conceptualized, we should be responsive to that. We shouldn't say, well, I was taught this in 2024 and I'm going to keep doing that until 2048. I think it's important to know that what we know now about learning and teaching is going to continue to grow. And part of this work is actually being really receptive to that and knowing that's a good thing to continue thinking through. It's not a trends-based thing or a fashionable thing. It's about utilizing the most supported and the best available evidence and research to inform our practice.
Exactly. And, I just thought of something as you're talking about this. I have a Ford Escape vehicle, and I'm very glad it is not one of the original Ford motor cars. I'm glad for the change in the experience that has happened over the decades and its development. And
There must be a story there. Is that some bad things happened with some of those Fords you're saying, or
they're found on road dead.
right,
That's what it
right.
stands for, found on road dead.
Yeah, interesting.
But yeah, I don't want to crank start the motor, right? I just want to turn it on and be
Just
able
press
to
the button
go.
now. You don't even need to turn a
Yeah,
key anymore. It's interesting, isn't
exactly.
it? Mm.
Exactly. And, I like that I don't have to roll down my window to use my arms for signals.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah. Well, and it's the thing. It's
embrace
about
the knowledge.
improving our knowledge, improving what is available to teachers, and I guess this is where the science is helpful, because if we rely on the best available research, things that have been empirically tested as well as theoretically conceptualized, this can really improve our practice. A lot of what we do in education is based on philosophy and based on what some big ideas in education have sort of pointed to, what's in vogue at the moment. And we have to be careful not to be swayed by things that are essentially pseudoscience, or essentially ideas that haven't got the full research and scientific research backing. So I'm hoping that examples like I've shared here, and like you do in this work that you do as well, Dr. Garforth, that it starts to cut through things that are currently pretty popular in the teaching zeitgeist and allow us to move into an age where we are using more research and using more scientific evidence to inform our practice.
Same. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Swain. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I'd look forward to speaking to you again.